Hello friends, this is Sachin and I welcome all of you to my YouTube channel. Friends, today we are going to discuss another poem by Alexander Pope and that is entitled as Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. Now let us discuss the introduction of this particular poem. Dr. Arbuthnot was hopelessly ill and had written Pope a last request that the poet should continue to attack vice in his satires. This poem, basically written during the summer of 1734, was published in January 1735, which was less than 2 months before Arbuthnot's death, who died in 1735 and was born in 1667. Arbuthnot was Queen Anne's favorite doctor and later had a similar relation to Princess Caroline, who in 1727 became Queen Caroline. Also during 1733, Pope was the victim of two bitter attacks by Lady Mary Wortley Montague and Lord Harvey. The poem is less an epistle than a dialogue between Pope and Arbuthnot, who is not introduced until line 75. Now let us discuss some themes in the poem. The poem is an attack on Pope's detractors and a defense of his own character and career. Pope uses every device of persuasive rhetoric, reasonable argument, and emotional appeals, subtly suggestive imagery, and superbly controlled shifts in tone and style. The poem expresses a span of emotions: anger, contempt, amusement, sarcasm, mock, self-pity, indignation, hatred, affection, gratitude, and tenderness. Also very effective is that Pope addresses Arbuthnot, a man known to be honest and kind. This acquisition of virtue through association is an effective stroke. In defense of his own character, in the final section of the poem, Pope portrays himself as a virtuous man, full of love, nursing his aged mother and asking heaven's blessing for his friend. This shows him furthest removed from the popular conception of the satirist as a malevolent man. There is also animal imagery associated in the poem. 5 main images emerge, all connected: animal, filth, disease, persecution, and the virtuous man. But the center one is the animal imagery. The animal image yields the filth, the noxious element out of which disease arises. Disease turns into persecution, and persecution reveals the virtuous man. The animal image comprises all references to animals, worms, and insects in the poem. Pope associates the poetasters with low Grub Street, but mentioned earlier in 111 line, a grub is the larva of certain insects, especially of a beetle. These people write and act without thinking, in automatic response to certain stimuli. They are like trained hawks. My dance by whistled off my hands. Or like frogs that live on flies, word catches that live on syllables. Furthermore, like spiders, they live in their own filth, so that disease flourishes in Grub Street. From there, in swarms and packs, the creatures descend on Pope, carrying their infection with them. Thus, Pope justifies satire from a man of peace. An analysis of the structure of the poem will reveal the persistent use of animal imagery. Now, without any further delay, let us discuss the analysis of the poem line by line. So friends, I'm not going to read the lines or the stanzas, I'm just going to explain the lines. Okay, so you read the stanzas on your own, or you can see it on your screen as well. Okay, so I'm not going to waste the time over reading every line. I'll just explaining the lines, so I hope you get that. Okay, so the poem opens with Pope speaking, not to Dr. Arbuthnot, but to his gardener John, who is ordered to shut the door of Pope's house to Tottenham, even tie up the knocker and admit no one. The house seems to be surrounded by mad poets. Old Bedlam is a reference to a mental institution, and Parnassus is the mountain of the classical poetic muses. In the second line of the poem, the disease image, I'm sick, I'm dead, is of course comic exaggeration. Pope is simply not at home to the poetasters. Line 3 uses animal imagery by suggesting that the would-be poets are mad dogs. Line 4, likewise, the correlation of Bedlam and Parnassus implies a more heroic metaphor in the connection of lunacy with poetry. The opening is effective because it builds suspense about why Pope is under siege. Why Pope's house is under siege. Next stanza. Pope lists examples of how these poetasters besiege and pester him, climbing through his shrubbery wall, using an underground entrance, or stopping him as he travelled in either his carriage or his boat. He protests that he cannot even go to church in peace without being bothered by the man of rhyme. Antithesis, he is under siege above ground and underground, on land and on water. Third stanza. Now, having listed how they attack, Pope next specifies some of the attackers. A besotted parson, a poetess, a rhyming peer, a legal clerk, and a madman. All fly to Tottenham, seeking the advice and encouragement of Pope. Not just a bother in themselves, they encourage their family members to slander Pope's name. A father faults Pope because his son imitates my damned works, and a husband curses Pope because his wife has eloped to Twickenham to get Pope's opinion of her poetry. Next stanza. Pope now turns and addresses Dr. Arbuthnot as friend of my life, his physician who had taken care of Pope through many illnesses. The plague of Pope's congenital ill health is now added to the plague of poetasters. Pope now examines his dire dilemma, which is speeding him to his death. These would-be poets demand that he read their works expecting praise, but Pope is trapped. He cannot lie by telling them that their poetry is good, yet dare not speak the truth for fear of hurting them. In a mock heroic picture, Pope portrays himself as the martyr on the rack. He finally decides to tell them to follow Horace's advice of waiting 9 years before they attempt to publish their works. Next stanza. This advice is received with amazement. One petitioner suggests that if there is something wrong with his poetry, Pope could spend some time in correcting it. Another poet's modest wishes are that Pope will write a prologue for his work and in addition lend him £10. Next stanza. Pope then shows how these poetasters take advantage of and intimidate him using one called Pytholion. Pytholion asks Pope's help in securing a sponsor, patron, for his poetry, even though he had previously labeled Pope. Pope is cautioned that unless he helps this person, Pytholion will attack Pope in the newspaper, a not so subtle form of blackmail. Pope next notes that if he receives, unsolicited manuscripts of plays from strangers, he says that if he writes disapprovingly of a play, the person threatens him with furies, death, and rage. However, if it praises it, the person seeks something more, for Pope to use his influence to get the play staged. The assault continues because even when the play is rejected by theatre producers, the writer suggests that Pope used his influence to get the play published. Of course, after Pope has revised it, he even offers to give Pope a share of the profits, as Pope is escorting him out the door. Both of these examples show that Pope tries to treat with courtesy these hack writers who impose their works on him. Unlike Dryden, Pope seldom uses comic feminine rhymes. What does here in 61-62, where Print It and Lintot, the name of a publisher, are rhymed. Next stanza. Pope uses a Midas analogy, basically calling the poetasters asses. Also, he states the reference to Minister and Queen probably refer to Volplay and Queen Caroline, thus making the ass-eared Midas King George II. At this point, Arbuthnot speaks, giving Pope the advice not to attack personally, particularly queens, ministers, or kings. However, Pope interrupts Arbuthnot in an attack upon all the fools, even referring to his own previously published Dunciad, calling each irritating writer an ass. Pope asks if it is cruel to tell a fool that he is a fool. He answers no, because they do not believe you. Those fools like Cordus can be engulfed in peals of laughter, but he is unconcerned with the laughter. Pope avers that it is impossible to shame a scribbler, for he brushes the criticism off and is soon at his dirty work again. Here, Pope's indignation supports the disgust of the animal and filth images where writers are portrayed as spiders. Pope then contends that his satiric attacks upon hack poets and writers such as the poet laureate Coley Saber and Ambrose Phillips have not changed them at all. So whom have I heard? When Pope refers to Sappho, Lady Mary Wortley Montague, Arbuthnot interrupts and says, "For God's sake, learn prudence." Arbuthnot's interruption also refers to Pope's extreme shortness. I, Arbuthnot, am twice as tall as you, Pope. And this is an instance where Pope shows that he can make fun of himself. Pope, however, again ignores the counsel and continues his scornful attack using the references to mad creatures, and it is the slower kills and not the white. Next stanza. Pope ridicules even those from Grub Street who praise and defend him. Pope knows they have an ulterior motive, expecting a bribe or for Pope to subscribe to one of their literary projects. He next describes the ridiculous homage which his suitors pay him. They compare him to Horace, Alexander the Great, Ovid, Virgil, and Homer. This is probably the most comic passage in the poem. Pope puns on his first name, for the poetasters couple him with Alexander the Great. The same tension between self-depreciation and self-glorification is carried over into lines 125 to 126, where Pope cries that his talent is a cursed inheritance or judgment of his guilty self. Line 25 is tongue-in-cheek, yet the biblical reference, John 9.2, carries with it a suggestion of solemnity. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? The phrase dipped me in ink may refer to Achilles, whose parent dipped him in the Styx to make him invulnerable. The fact that Pope has just been poking fun at himself, especially at his physical shortcomings, I'm short, one shoulder too high, enables him to make a serious and moving reference to his ill health without seeming maudlin. This long disease my life. Thus, from the previous predominantly humorous passage, Pope turns to pathos, the transition effected by the serious suggestion of Pope as a great poet. Next stanza. So here, Arbuthnot asks Pope why he publishes, since he knows that he will expose himself to ridicule. Pope's answer lists the writers who encouraged him to develop his writing talent. Okay, and he states this list establishes Pope as the successor of Dryden and thus places him far above his Grub Street persecutors. All the writers mentioned were associated with Dryden in his later years and had all discouraged the young Pope. Next stanza. Pope maintains that he never initiated any literary attacks. His early poetry was pastoral and descriptive, not satiric. Even when two early critics, Gildon and Danis, attacked him, Pope says that he sat still and did not respond, accepting that these hack writers were either provoked by madness, bedlam, or a need of money, the mint. Next stanza. Pope then tells how he responded to some more sober critic. He said that if their commentary on his literary work was wrong, he did not respond but simply smiled. However, if the critics were right, Pope said that he graciously acknowledged the correction. If right, I kiss the rod. While positing that they lacked good sense, Pope acknowledges these critics exacting scholarship, their mania that commas and points, periods, we set exactly right. He then damns by praising Theobald, pronounced and often spelled Tybalt, and Bentley. First, he puns on their self-importance, might, and their insignificance, might, in the word might, M-I-T-E, and it were a sin to rob them of their might. Again, in order to ridicule, he uses a comic feminine rhyme, Ribards and Tibards. He inflates only to deflate each word catcher that lives on syllables. Even such small critics some regard may claim, by attaching their names to Shakespeare's or Milton's through editing these great writers' works. Using animal imagery, Pope then compares them to grubs or worms. Next stanza. Now, next Pope justifies his attacks on some poets as simply giving them but their due. He says that these poets were barren of talent, but filled with an overblown self-esteem. Pride adds to emptiness. He first mentions Ambrose Phillips, who Pope contends writes for money, that is, to get half a crown, a prostitute's customary fee. He senses Phillips' pretensions of laboring over his poems, which causes him to publish little, while saying that the barrenness of his ideas is more likely the cause of his hard-bound brains turning out only 8 lines a year. A second poet is attacked for plagiarizing most of his ideas from other writers, steals much. A third poet tries to impress by making his poems appear to be difficult, while in truth the poet does not know what he is writing. Blunders round about a meaning. Here Pope uses a rare feminine rhyme, leaning and meaning. A fourth poet is attacked for his affected style of writing. It is not poetry, but prose run mad. Pope says that his own modest satire was directed at all these poets, 9 of whom it would take to make one unqualified poet laureate. And on that 9 such poets made it 8. a reference to Nathan Tate, the poet laureate from 1692 to 1715. Next, he states that the line refers to the old adage that it takes 9 tailors to make one man. Pope says that these insignificant poets fumed and roared at his appraisal of them and swore not Addison himself was safe. Pope's not so subtle lead into his portrait of Addison as Atticus. Next passage, that is Atticus passage. Here it is called Atticus passage because the Atticus portrait grammatically is one sentence of 22 lines. Generosity, kindness, courage, wholeheartedness, and humility seem mainly what Atticus lacks. The passage begins by commenting on line 194. Peace to all such. It asserts that all such who would dare attack Addison will keep their peace. Of course, Pope then starts a subtle attack on Addison, who dies in 1719, 16 years before the poem, who is called Atticus here. Pope begins by praising Atticus for his genius and his talent as a writer and conversationalist. How the praise turns to criticism when Pope wonders whether Atticus was so egotistical that he would allow no one to challenge his rule. Unpleasant words are brought forward and associated with Atticus, jealous and hate. These qualities caused Atticus to judge other writers circumspectly, damned with faint praise. Atticus was cowardly and sneaky in his approach to criticism of others. He would not strike, but would nevertheless wound by hinting a fault and hesitating dislike. He lacked courage, but retained guile, a timorous foe and a suspicious friend. He was a literary tyrant who loved to hear his admirers applaud him. Pope concludes that in perspective, such a contradictory man deserves to be laughed at, although the laughers would cry if they were like Addison. Who but must laugh if such a man here be? Who would no weep if Atticus were he? Next stanza. Pope says that though Atticus's group smeared his name, he never curried favor from that group. He states that he no more heeded with what this group said of him than did King George pay attention to the poem annually written by the poet laureate on the monarch's birthday. Pope says he avoided such whittlings, using the disease image to subread about the itch, probably suggest gonorrhea. He continues that he refused to become a London lapdog. Pope says that he wanted nothing to do with a culture where a poet had to curry favor from a patron such as Buffon. Here Pope attacks the tasteless patron of the arts. Buffon means toad in Latin, but it is similar to French word bouffon, meaning puffed up. Pope puns on this meaning in full-blown Buffon, puffed by every quill, hired poet. Those who called on Buffon came only pretending to want his judgment of their poems. Actually, they sought his help in getting them a position or sponge off of his ample table of food and wine. Great poets such as Dryden avoided Buffon, whose English identity is never established. Although Buffon never helped Dryden while Dryden was alive, in fact Pope accuses Buffon helped to starve Dryden. Buffon helped to bury him. That is, he contributed to the lavish funeral Dryden was given. This episode shows that Buffon is comfortable around flattering minor poets or great dead poets, but never great living poets, since these would show Buffon up as the literary fraud he is. Next stanza. Pope says that Buffon would be a perfect match for Bavius, the bad poet mentioned above in line 99. May every Bavius have his Buffon still. In fact, Pope says he is pleased that the bad poet can give flattery to the tasteless patron on demand, for this situation will free Pope from having to confront either. My duns by duns be whisked off my hands. Pope then recalls his friend, the poet and playwright John Gay, now dead 3 years. He died in 1732. Pope condemns literary London, which let Gay, a neglected genius, neglected die. Given this shameful treatment of Gay, Pope refers to live away from London society, maintaining a poet's dignity and a life above a pattern. However, he does say that he has, as my friend, a former chief political minister, Henry St. John, Lord Bolingbroke. Pope concludes that he was not meant to be a court poet, since he can pay his debt, does not wish to sacrifice his religious beliefs, does not care to be always thinking of a poem to sell or to be used to flatter a patron, and does not have to keep up with the latest literary gossip, all which disgraceful activities presumable a Bavius would have to. Next stanza. Pope then shifts to mock self-pity. Everyone in literary London, he states, is continually asking What next work of Pope's shall see the light? Pope seems to disdain this attention, protesting pitifully that life has no joys for me. People feel except for his poetry. Pope says that when Swift visits him, the gossips speculate about the nature of Pope's next satire, presumably inspired by his conversation with Swift. If Pope denies he is planning any new poem, the critics counter that his genius never can lie still. A self-aggrandizing technique Pope uses to have his enemies, not himself, praise Pope as a genius. When lesser wits, Serville or Bubo turn out something, many claim mistakenly it is by Pope. The ignorance of such speculation and miscalculation Pope says he smiles at, especially those who profess to know Pope by my style. Pope then curses any verses of his own which have turned a worthy person into his foe, have caused an innocent person to fear, or have caused a virgin to shed a tear. He censes anyone who uses words wickedly to bring distress to harmless people, who loves a lie and helps to slander someone, who libels, who attacks an author behind his back or pretends to like something he does not, and who to one's face calls a person his friend, but he will not defend his friend against slander. Pope continues his attack on hypocrisy, citing a person who betrays a person's confidence by revealing what was said in private, who deliberately misconstrues a person's poems. Such blockheads, Pope says, he will lash, although a lash like mine no honest man shall dread. It is called the Sporus passage. Before Arbuthnot interposes, Pope begins by saying that Sporus is such a blockhead and should tremble. Sporus, as it is revealed, is John, Lord Harvey, an effeminate courtier who with Lady Mary Montague had attacked Pope in pamphlets. The original Sporus was a boy whom the Emperor Nero publicly married. In all other places where Arbuthnot interrupted, it was to stop Pope's anger, but here he interposes to agree. To Arbuthnot, Sporus is simply a thing of silk, a mere white curd of ass's milk, who has no feeling and is so sensitive that he breaks a butterfly upon a heel. To Pope, Sporus is a gilded bug that stings and stings. He is a fawning, mumbling spaniel, a shallow stream, or a puppet. Then all beauty and delicacy gone, Sporus becomes an ugly, filth-spitting toad. As such, he is a perpetual menace as the tempter, powerless himself but always lurking at the ear of Eve, to usurp the powers of good and pervert them. After introducing this image, Pope returns to it later, where Sporus is called Eve's tempter, like Satan as the serpent. Sporus with his cherub's face, but his reptile all the rest, creeps and licks the dust, its valley in the dirt. Between that and this, now muster up, now miss. Sporus can act either part, the male or the female. One vile antithesis, this amphibian thing now trips a lady and now struts a lord. The Sporus passage has the greatest concentration of animal images in the poem and is the pinnacle of the animal filth imagery. In its climatic progression, it becomes an accumulation of disgust, with Sporus going from a beneath contempt, spaciously attractive, almost non-existence being at the beginning of the passage to a filthy, abhorrent creature, a toad which is spitting forth froth and venom at its end. Upon reaching this pitch of feeling, Pope drops for good his mask of irony and shows himself as the Solomon and righteous man. Now he can speak of himself in the third person and in an exalted mode. His virtuous qualities contrast with those vicious ones of Atticus, Flavius, Buffo, Sporus, and the bad poets. Unlike them, Pope says he never wrote for money or to further his ambition. He never flattered even to kings and never used his poetry to lie. His poetry affirmed truth and stressed morality. For sticking to these principles, Pope says he has had to endure the furious foe, the timid friend, and the damning critic, half-approving wit. Also, he has suffered threats of vengeance and false reports circulated by Harvey and Montague that Pope had been subjected to a whipping. In addition, much trash and dullness, not his own, was published, which some attributed as his own poetry. Pope says many even ridiculed him because of his physical deformity, as in caricatures showing him as a hunchbacked ape. He says they even maligned his dead father. Against all of these attackers and attacks, Pope says he has maintained his fair virtue. Next stanza. This section continues to gradually refine away the scorn that emanates from the Sporus passage by stressing Pope's patience and poetry. Arbuthnot interposes to ask why Pope attacks both the low and the great. Pope answers that he dislikes all names no matter their station, whether Sporus, who had the queen's ear, or a common forger. It could be someone who, Pope says, using antithesis, may gain his prince's ear or lose his own as a forger does, whose ears are cut off when he is convicted of forgery. Pope confesses that far from being mean and spiteful, he was even gullible. Because of his soft nature, he was often deceived in friends such as Sappho, Lady Mary Montague. Pope then lists those who attacked him, but whom he still helped when they needed him: Denis, Tybalt, Cibber, and even Moore. Although the last was unintentionally helped, since Moore got his assistance by plagiarizing from Pope's poetry. Pope again asks, full 10 years slandered, did he once reply? Even when the two Curls of Town and Court, the publisher and Harvey, attacked his family, Pope says he felt he had to reply. Now he shows his family pride by praising the virtues of his father and mother, whose unspotted names will live in memory and poetry. Next stanza. In the wistful description of his father's life which follows, Pope not only demonstrates a proper filial devotion but also announces his own ideal life, the life of peace on a few paternal acres. He says his father was a self-made man who earned his portion honorably, a mild man who married an equally gentle wife. His father never raged, did harm to others, or lied. His father never used any language but the language of the heart. He was honest, wise, and temperate, dying of old age, not of disease. Pope says that he wished he had been accorded such a life and hopes that he himself will be granted such a death. Next stanza. Finally, the love and yearning of this passage is brought to an even higher pitch in the prayer-like close, the climax of the good man image and thus of the poem itself. Pope turns and addresses Arbuthnot as friend and hopes that Arbuthnot will have domestic bliss. Pope hopes that he can spend his own old age principally doing only one thing, taking care of his aged mother. You need to note one thing, that Pope's mother died in 1733, 2 years before this poem was published. But when these lines were written in 1731, when Pope was nursing his mother through a serious illness. He closes again by wishing happiness for the ailing Arbuthnot. The last two lines of the poem are given to Arbuthnot, who pronounces that heaven will determine what is to come. Significantly, the last word of the poem is heaven. So friends, finally this poem comes to an end. I hope you have understood the poem and got the basic idea behind the poem. If you have any question, you can put it in the comment section. Thank you very much for watching the video. Have a great day.